The barn door slammed shut behind Jessica Green as she pressed her back against the rough wooden planks, her breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. Outside, the voices of Ronald Kelly and his men grew louder, their torches casting dancing shadows through the gaps in the weathered boards. Her fingers trembled as she clutched the small bundle of her remaining possessions, everything she had left in this harsh Norse settlement where winter showed no mercy to the desperate. She has to be here somewhere. Ronald's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. No woman survives alone in weather like this. Jessica closed her eyes, remembering the words she had spoken just hours before, words that had sealed her fate and brought her to this moment of terror. "I'll sleep in the barn. Just give me work," she had pleaded, standing in the great hall for the assembled men of the settlement. The desperation in her voice had been unmistakable, the kind of raw need that came from watching loved ones die and having nowhere left to turn. But then Jeffrey Thomas had stepped forward from the shadows near the fire, his massive frame casting an even larger shadow across the rush-covered floor. His presence had changed everything, though Jessica hadn't understood it at the time. "You'll sleep next to me," he had said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the other men like an axe through wood. Now, as footsteps circled the barn and voices debated her fate, Jessica wondered if she had made the right choice in running. The wind howled through the settlement, carrying with it the promise of a storm that would bury the weak and leave only the strong standing when spring finally returned to this God's forsaken place. 3 months earlier, Jessica had arrived at the settlement with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of grief. The ship that had carried her family's hopes across the treacherous northern seas had been lost to a storm, taking with it her husband, her children, and every dream she had ever dared to nurture. The captain who had pulled her from the wreckage had deposited her here at this remote outpost where Norse tradition and harsh necessity governed every aspect of life. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The settlement clung to existence on the edge of a fjord, its wooden buildings huddled together like frightened animals seeking warmth. Smoke rose constantly from the chimneys, a testament to the endless battle against the cold that claimed lives as readily as any sword. The people here had learned to measure worth in practical terms. Could you work? Could you fight? Could you survive another winter without becoming a burden on those who could? Jessica had tried to prove her worth from the moment she arrived. She had offered her services to Carolyn Kim, the settlement's most respected woman, who managed the weaving and textile work that kept everyone clothed. But Carolyn's workshop was already full, and winter was no time for charity. She had approached Barbara Scott, who oversaw the food stores and preservation. But Barbara had looked at Jessica's soft hands in gentle manner and shaken her head with something that might have been pity. "You're not built for this life," Barbara had told her, not unkindly. "This place breaks people who were born to it. What chance does a soft Southern woman have?" But Jessica had refused to accept defeat. She had swept floors in exchange for scraps of bread, mended clothes for a corner near someone's fire, and slowly learned the rhythms of a community where survival was never guaranteed. She watched the way the men returned from their hunting expeditions, their faces grim with the knowledge that every failed hunt brought the settlement closer to starvation. She observed how the women rationed every grain of wheat, every strip of dried meat, calculating and recalculating whether their stores would last until spring. As the weeks passed, Jessica began to understand the complex hierarchy that governed the settlement. At the top were the proven warriors and hunters, men like Ronald Kelly, who led expeditions and brought back the resources that kept everyone alive. Below them were the skilled craftsmen and the women who managed the domestic sphere, people whose abilities were essential, but whose social standing depended on their usefulness to those above them. And then there were people like Jessica, the displaced and desperate, who existed on the margins and survived only through the grudging tolerance of others. She had seen what happened to those who could no longer contribute. They simply disappeared one morning, walking out into the snow and never returning. It was considered an honorable way to die, preferable to becoming a burden on the community. The first time Jessica truly noticed Jeffrey Thomas, he was returning from a week-long hunting expedition that had yielded nothing but frostbite and disappointment. While the other men complained bitterly about the harsh conditions and the scarcity of game, Jeffrey had simply nodded to the settlement's leaders and disappeared into his small dwelling at the edge of the community. He lived alone, which was unusual in a place where shared warmth often meant the difference between life and death. Jessica had heard the whispers about him, fragments of stories that painted him as something of an outsider even among a community of survivors. He had arrived several years earlier under circumstances that no one seemed eager to discuss, and he had earned his place through competence rather than kinship. Some said he had been cast out from another settlement for reasons that remained mysterious. Others claimed he had simply chosen solitude over the complicated politics of community life. What everyone agreed on was that Jeffrey Thomas was formidable. He stood a head taller than most men, with shoulders broad enough to carry burdens that would crush others. His hands, scarred from countless battles with both nature and men, could wield an axe with devastating precision or craft delicate tools with surprising skill. His face, weathered by years of harsh winds and bitter cold, revealed little of his thoughts, but his eyes missed nothing. Jessica found herself watching him more often than she cared to admit. There was something compelling about his quiet competence, the way he moved through the settlement like a wolf among dogs, belonging but never quite part of the pack. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. His words carried weight because they were never wasted on empty boasts or idle complaints. It was Cynthia Baker who first suggested that Jessica might find work with Jeffrey. Cynthia managed the settlement's small infirmary, tending to injuries and illnesses with a combination of practical knowledge and grim determination. She had taken a liking to Jessica, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who refused to surrender to despair. "He lives alone," Cynthia had said one evening as they sat by the fire in the common hall. "A man like that, he could use someone to manage his household, keep his dwelling in order. He's not much for conversation, but he's fair in his dealings." Jessica had considered the suggestion with mixed feelings. The idea of working for Jeffrey Thomas was both appealing and terrifying. She had observed enough to know that he was different from the other men in the settlement, less prone to the casual cruelty that seemed to flourish in harsh conditions. But she had also heard the stories about his past, the hints of violence that clung to him like smoke from a fire. Still, as winter deepened and her welcome in other households grew increasingly thin, Jessica found herself with few alternatives. She had watched too many people disappear into the snow to ignore the reality of her situation. If she could not find a way to make herself useful, she would not survive to see spring. The opportunity came sooner than she had expected. A severe storm had damaged several buildings in the settlement, and Jeffrey had volunteered to lead the repair efforts. Jessica had joined the group of women who prepared meals for the workers, and she had noticed how Jeffrey organized the labor with quiet efficiency. While other men shouted orders and complained about the conditions, he simply demonstrated what needed to be done and trusted others to follow his example. When the work was finished, Jessica had lingered as the others departed, gathering her courage for what she knew might be her only chance. Jeffrey was securing his tools, his movements methodical and precise, when she approached him. "I need work," she had said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "I can cook, clean, mend clothes. I don't eat much, and I won't be any trouble." Jeffrey had looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Jessica had forced herself to meet his gaze, knowing that any sign of weakness would doom her request. She had seen how he evaluated people, the way his eyes cataloged strengths and weaknesses with the dispassionate precision of a hunter assessing prey. "Winter's hard on everyone," he had finally said. "Harder on some than others." "I know what I'm asking," Jessica had replied. "I know what happens to people who can't pull their weight. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to earn my keep." Jeffrey had nodded slowly as if her answer had confirmed something he had already suspected. "My dwelling is small. There's a loft where you could sleep, but it's cold and cramped. I'll sleep in the barn if necessary," Jessica had said quickly, desperate to secure any arrangement that would keep her alive through the winter. "Just give me work." But Jeffrey had shaken his head. "No one sleeps in the barn, not in weather like this." His voice had carried a finality that brooked no argument. "If you work for me, you sleep where it's warm. That's not negotiable." The arrangement had worked better than Jessica had dared to hope. Jeffrey's dwelling was indeed small, consisting of a single room with a sleeping alcove and a loft that served as storage. But it was well built and warm, with thick walls that kept out the worst of the winter wind and a stone hearth that provided both heat and light. Jessica had made herself useful from the first day, organizing Jeffrey's sparse possessions, preparing his meals, and maintaining the dwelling with the attention to detail that he seemed to appreciate. Their interactions were limited but cordial. Jeffrey would leave before dawn to check his traps or join hunting parties, returning in the evening with whatever game he had managed to secure. Jessica would have a hot meal waiting for him, and they would eat together in companionable silence. He was not much for conversation, as Cynthia had warned, but Jessica found his quiet presence oddly comforting after months of uncertainty and fear. As the weeks passed, Jessica began to understand the rhythms of Jeffrey's life. He was methodical in everything he did, from the way he maintained his weapons to the careful attention he paid to the weather signs that might indicate good hunting. He wasted nothing, whether it was food, materials, or energy, and he expected the same efficiency from Jessica. But he was never harsh in his corrections, simply pointing out better ways to accomplish tasks with the patience of someone who understood that survival depended on constant learning. The other women in the settlement watched Jessica's new arrangement with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Some, like Cynthia, seemed pleased that she had found a secure position. Others whispered among themselves about the propriety of a woman living alone with a man who was not her husband. But Jessica had learned to ignore the gossip, focusing instead on the practical benefits of her situation. She was warm, fed, and useful, which was more than she had dared to hope for when she first arrived at the settlement. It was Christina Myers who first warned Jessica about Ronald Kelly's growing interest in her situation. Christina worked in the Great Hall, serving meals and cleaning up after the community gatherings, and she heard all the conversations that took place around the long wooden tables where the settlement's business was conducted. "Ronald's been asking questions about you," Christina had said one morning when she encountered Jessica at the well, "about your arrangement with Jeffrey, about whether you're truly earning your keep." Jessica had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Ronald Kelly was the settlement's most influential leader, a man whose word carried the weight of law in this remote place. If he decided that Jessica was a burden on the community, there would be little that Jeffrey or anyone else could do to protect her. "What kind of questions?" Jessica had asked, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Christina had glanced around nervously before answering. "He thinks it's unseemly for a woman to live alone with a man who's not her kin. Says it sets a bad example for the other women. And he's been suggesting that maybe you're not contributing as much as you claim." Jessica had spent the rest of that day in a state of growing anxiety, wondering if her precarious security was about to collapse. She had worked harder than ever, preparing an elaborate meal for Jeffrey and ensuring that every corner of the dwelling was spotless. But when Jeffrey returned that evening, he had seemed distracted, his usual calm demeanor replaced by something that might have been tension. "There's going to be a gathering tomorrow night," he had told her as they ate. "The whole settlement. Ronald wants to discuss the winter stores, make sure everyone's pulling their weight." Jessica had understood immediately what this meant. Ronald was planning to make her situation a public issue, to force the community to decide whether she deserved to remain. The thought of standing before the assembled settlers, defending her right to exist, filled her with a terror that made it difficult to swallow her food. "What should I do?" she had asked, hating the way her voice trembled, despite her efforts to remain calm. Jeffrey had looked at her across the small table, his expression serious. "Tell the truth. You've worked hard. You have earned your place. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." But Jessica had seen the doubt in his eyes. The recognition that truth and justice were luxuries that harsh places like this could rarely afford. If the community decided that she was expendable, there would be little that Jeffrey could do to change their minds without risking his own position. The next evening, the Great Hall was packed with every adult member of the settlement. The long tables had been arranged to face a raised platform where Ronald Kelly and the other leaders sat in judgment. Jessica had taken a place near the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous, but she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as Ronald called the gathering to order. The first part of the meeting dealt with practical matters: the state of the food stores, plans for spring planting, repairs that would be needed when the weather improved. Jessica had tried to pay attention, but her mind kept wandering to what she would say when Ronald inevitably called her forward. She had rehearsed her arguments dozens of times, but they all seemed inadequate in the face of the community's collective judgment. When Ronald finally turned his attention to Jessica, the hall fell silent with the kind of expectant hush that preceded either celebration or execution. He had stood slowly, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the assembled crowd, and Jessica had felt her heart hammering against her ribs as he began to speak. "We have among us a woman who came to our settlement with nothing," Ronald had said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the hall. "She has no family here, no established trade, no particular skills that we desperately need. Yet she has found shelter and sustenance, while others who have contributed far more to our survival continue to struggle." Jessica had felt the hostile stares of some of the other women, people who had their own struggles and saw her as competition for scarce resources. She had wanted to stand and defend herself, but something in Jeffrey's posture had warned her to wait, to let Ronald reveal his full intentions before responding. "I'm not suggesting that we should turn away those in need," Ronald had continued, his tone reasonable but underlaid with steel. "But we must be practical. Winter is long, and our stores are limited. Everyone must contribute according to their abilities, and everyone must be held to the same standards." The implication had been clear. Jessica was being accused of not meeting those standards. She had risen to her feet, her legs unsteady, but her voice determined. "I work every day," she had said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I cook, clean, mend clothes, and maintain a household. I ask for nothing more than the chance to earn my keep through honest labor." Ronald had smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "And yet you live in comfort while others sleep crowded together, sharing resources and space. You eat regular meals while others make do with less. How is this fair to the rest of our community?" Jessica had felt the trap closing around her, the way Ronald was twisting her circumstances to make her appear selfish and privileged. She had opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Jeffrey had risen from his seat near the front of the hall. "She earns her keep," he had said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation like an axe through wood. "Every day, without complaint, without asking for special treatment. Anyone who questions her contribution is welcome to examine my household and judge for themselves." The hall had fallen silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. Jeffrey commanded respect in a way that even Ronald could not ignore, and his public endorsement carried significant weight. But Jessica had seen the flash of anger in Ronald's eyes, the recognition that his carefully orchestrated challenge was being undermined. "I'm sure she performs her duties adequately," Ronald had replied, his tone now carrying a subtle sneer. "But the question remains, is it appropriate for an unmarried woman to live alone with a man who is not her kin? What message does this send to our young people? What precedent does it set for others who might seek similar arrangements?" This was the real attack, Jessica had realized. Ronald was not questioning her work ethic or her contributions to the community. He was challenging the propriety of her living situation, using the settlement's conservative values as a weapon against her. It was a clever strategy, one that would be difficult to counter without appearing to advocate for the breakdown of social order. Jeffrey had stepped forward, his massive frame now fully visible to everyone in the hall. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Jessica Green has conducted herself with honor and dignity. Anyone who suggests otherwise insults not only her, but me as well." The challenge had been unmistakable. And Jessica had seen several men in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. In a community where physical prowess often determined social standing, few were willing to directly confront Jeffrey Thomas. But Ronald was not though easily intimidated. "I'm not questioning anyone's honor," he had said smoothly. "I'm simply pointing out that appearances matter. A woman living alone with a man creates talk, and talk creates division. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if more appropriate arrangements could be made." Jessica had understood then that this was not really about her at all. This was about power, about Ronald's need to demonstrate his authority over every aspect of the settlement's social structure. She was simply a convenient target, someone whose precarious position made her vulnerable to attack. But as she had stood there, feeling the weight of the community's judgment, something had shifted inside her. The fear that had dominated her thoughts for months began to transform into something harder and more resilient. She had survived the loss of her family, the destruction of her previous life, and months of uncertainty and desperation. She would not be broken by the petty politics of men who mistook cruelty for strength. "I'll sleep in the barn," she had said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Just give me work." The words had hung in the air like a challenge, and Jessica had seen the surprise in Ronald's eyes. He had expected her to crumble under pressure, to beg for mercy, or accept whatever arrangement he deemed appropriate. Instead, she had offered to make the sacrifice that would address his stated concerns while maintaining her independence and dignity. But before Ronald could respond, Jeffrey had stepped forward again, and this time there was something dangerous in his posture. "No," he had said, his voice carrying a finality that seemed to fill the entire hall. "You'll sleep next to me." The gasps and murmurs that followed had been audible throughout the hall, but Jeffrey had ignored them, his attention focused entirely on Ronald. "If you have concerns about propriety, then let me address them directly. Jessica Green is under my protection. Anyone who questions that arrangement questions me." Jessica had felt her knees go weak with a mixture of relief and terror. Jeffrey was publicly claiming responsibility for her, but in doing so, he was also escalating the confrontation with Ronald to a level that could have serious consequences for both of them. In a community where reputation and standing were matters of life and death, such challenges were not made lightly. Ronald had stood silent for a long moment, clearly calculating his next move. He was a skilled politician who understood the dynamics of power, but he was also facing a man whose physical capabilities were legendary throughout the settlement. More importantly, Jeffrey's reputation for fairness and competence gave his words a moral authority that would be difficult to challenge directly. "I see," Ronald had finally said, his tone carefully neutral. "So you're proposing to take full responsibility for her welfare and conduct?" "I am," Jeffrey had replied without hesitation. "And if she proves to be a burden on the community? If her presence creates problems or divisions?" Jeffrey's response had been immediate and uncompromising. "Then hold me accountable. But judge her by her actions, not by your assumptions about what those actions might be." Jessica had watched this exchange with growing amazement. Jeffrey was essentially staking his own reputation and position on her behalf, making a commitment that went far beyond the simple employment arrangement they had established. She had wondered what had motivated him to take such a risk, what he saw in her that made such a gesture worthwhile. The debate had continued for another hour, with various members of the community weighing in on both sides of the issue. Some supported Ronald's position, arguing that traditional values and social order were essential for survival in such harsh conditions. Others backed Jeffrey, pointing to Jessica's obvious contributions and questioning the wisdom of driving away willing workers during the hardest part of winter. In the end, the matter had been resolved through a combination of Jeffrey's moral authority and the community's practical recognition that Jessica was indeed pulling her weight. Ronald had graciously accepted the consensus, though Jessica had seen the cold calculation in his eyes that suggested the matter was far from settled in his mind. As the gathering had broken up and people filed out into the bitter night air, Jessica had found herself walking beside Jeffrey in silence. The snow crunched under their feet, and their breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. She had wanted to thank him for his support, but the magnitude of what he had done seemed to render ordinary expressions of gratitude inadequate. "You didn't have to do that," she had finally said as they approached his dwelling. Jeffrey had paused at the door, his hand on the wooden latch. "Yes, I did," he had replied simply. "It was the right thing to do." Inside the warm interior of the dwelling, Jessica had prepared tea while Jeffrey banked the fire for the night. The familiar routine had been comforting after the tension of the evening, but Jessica had found herself acutely aware of the changed dynamic between them. Jeffrey's public declaration had created new obligations and expectations that neither of them had fully explored. "What happens now?" she had asked as they sat by the fire, the tea warming their hands and the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jeffrey had been quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the flickering flames. "Now we continue as we have been," he had said finally. "You do your work, I do mine. The rest of the world can think what it likes." But Jessica had sensed that something fundamental had shifted between them. Jeffrey's willingness to publicly defend her had revealed depths to his character that she had only glimpsed before. She had seen the way other men deferred to him, the respect that his quiet competence commanded, and she had begun to understand that his protection was both more valuable and more dangerous than she had initially realized. Over the following weeks, Jessica had noticed subtle changes in how the other settlers treated her. Some seemed more respectful, acknowledging her connection to Jeffrey and the security that relationship provided. Others appeared more hostile, resentful of what they perceived as special treatment, but most simply accepted her presence as part of the settlement's complex social fabric, no longer questioning her right to be there. The work continued as before, with Jessica managing Jeffrey's household while he pursued his various responsibilities around the settlement. But their evening conversations had become longer and more personal, as if the public confrontation had broken down barriers that had previously kept them at a careful distance. Jessica had learned that Jeffrey's past was indeed complicated, though he revealed details slowly and reluctantly. He had been born in a settlement far to the south, where he had trained as both a warrior and a craftsman. A dispute with the local leaders over their treatment of the community's most vulnerable members had led to his exile, a punishment that had saved his life but cost him everything he had known. "I could have stayed and kept quiet," he had told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "Could have ignored the injustices and focused on my own survival. But some things are more important than safety." Jessica had understood then why Jeffrey had been willing to risk his position for her sake. His sense of justice was not merely theoretical, but had already cost him dearly in the past. He was a man who acted according to his principles regardless of the personal consequences, a quality that was both admirable and potentially dangerous in their harsh world. As winter deepened and the settlement's isolation became more complete, Jessica had found herself drawn into Jeffrey's daily routines. She had accompanied him on his trap lines, learning to read the signs that indicated where game might be found. She had helped him repair equipment and maintain the various tools that their survival depended upon. Gradually, she had become not just his housekeeper, but his partner in the endless struggle against the elements. The transformation had been gradual but profound. The frightened, desperate woman who had arrived at the settlement months earlier had been replaced by someone harder and more capable. Jessica's hands had grown calloused from work, her body stronger from physical labor, and her mind sharper from the constant need to solve practical problems. She had learned to judge weather patterns, to preserve food efficiently, and to make the countless small decisions that determined whether they would be comfortable or merely survive. Jeffrey had watched this transformation with what might have been approval, though his expressions remained as difficult to read as ever. He had begun to rely on her judgment in matters that went beyond simple household management, consulting her about trap placement and asking her opinion on various settlement issues. Jessica had realized that she was no longer just earning her keep, but had become genuinely valuable to him. The realization had been both empowering and terrifying. For the first time since her arrival, Jessica had felt secure in her position, confident that she had proven her worth beyond any reasonable doubt. But she had also become aware of how much she had come to depend on Jeffrey's protection and companionship. The thought of losing either filled her with a dread that went far beyond practical concerns about survival. It was during one of the worst storms of the winter that Jessica had truly understood the depth of her feelings for Jeffrey. The wind had howled around their dwelling for 3 days, piling snow against the walls and making it impossible to venture outside. They had been trapped together in the small space, forced to rely entirely on their stored supplies and each other's company. Rather than feeling confined, Jessica had found the enforced intimacy oddly comforting. She had watched Jeffrey work on various projects, mending equipment and crafting new tools with the patience of someone who understood that quality work required time and attention. His quiet competence had been reassuring in the face of the storm's fury, a reminder that human skill and determination could triumph over even the harshest natural forces. On the third night, as the wind finally began to subside, Jeffrey had looked up from the leather harness he was repairing and caught Jessica watching him. For a moment, their eyes had met and held, and Jessica had felt something pass between them, that had nothing to do with their practical arrangement or the settlement's social expectations. "The storm's breaking," Jeffrey had said quietly, though his attention remained focused on Jessica rather than the weather outside. "Yes," Jessica had replied, though she had found herself reluctant to see their isolation end. The outside world would intrude soon enough, bringing with it all the complications and dangers that their temporary sanctuary had held at bay. When morning came and they were finally able to venture outside, Jessica had been struck by how the storm had transformed the landscape. Snow had drifted against buildings and fences, creating new contours and hiding familiar landmarks. The settlement looked different, somehow smaller and more fragile under its blanket of white, and Jessica had been reminded of how precarious their existence really was. The work of digging out had occupied everyone for days, with the entire community laboring to clear paths and restore access to essential buildings. Jessica had joined the effort without being asked, working alongside the other women to shovel snow and carry supplies. She had noticed how naturally she had fallen into the rhythm of communal labor, no longer an outsider seeking acceptance, but simply another member of the community doing her part. It was during this period of recovery that Ronald Kelly had made his next move. Rather than confronting Jessica directly, he had begun to spread subtle doubts about Jeffrey's judgment and reliability. The whispers had started small, questions about whether Jeffrey's protection of Jessica was affecting his commitment to the settlement's broader welfare. Christina Myers had brought Jessica the first reports of Ronald's campaign, her face troubled as she described the conversations she had overheard. "He's being clever about it," Christina had explained, "not saying anything directly, just asking questions that make people wonder. Whether Jeffrey's spending too much time on personal matters, whether his judgment might be compromised." Jessica had felt a familiar chill of fear, but this time it had been mixed with anger. Ronald was not content to have lost their previous confrontation. He was determined to find another way to challenge Jeffrey's authority and, by extension, Jessica's security. But his new approach was more dangerous because it was harder to counter directly. "What can we do?" Jessica had asked, though she had suspected that the options were limited. Christina had shaken her head grimly. "Not much, directly, but people respect results more than words. If Jeffrey continues to be successful in his responsibilities, if you continue to contribute to the community, then Ronald's whispers will lose their power." The advice had been sound, but Jessica had understood that they were now engaged in a longer and more subtle conflict than the direct confrontation in the Great Hall. Ronald was playing a patient game, slowly undermining Jeffrey's position through accumulated doubts and suggestions rather than open challenges. Jessica had shared Christina's warnings with Jeffrey that evening, watching his face carefully for signs of concern or anger. But his expression had remained calm, though she had detected a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was taking the threat seriously. "Ronald's ambitious," Jeffrey had said after considering her report. "He sees leadership of the settlement as a stepping stone to greater things. Anyone who might challenge his authority becomes a potential obstacle." "Are you challenging his authority?" Jessica had asked. Jeffrey had been quiet for a moment, staring into the fire as he formulated his response. "Not intentionally, but by protecting you, by refusing to bend to his will, I'm demonstrating that his power has limits. That's something he can't allow to stand unchallenged." Jessica had understood then that their conflict with Ronald was about more than just her place in the settlement. It was about the fundamental question of how power should be exercised in their small community, whether through fear and intimidation or through respect and competence. Jeffrey represented an alternative model of leadership that threatened Ronald's approach, making him a target regardless of his intentions. The realization had been sobering, but it had also clarified Jessica's thinking about her own situation. She was not just fighting for her own survival, but had become part of a larger struggle over the settlement's character and values. The responsibility was daunting, but it had also given her a sense of purpose that went beyond mere self-preservation. As winter had continued its relentless assault on the settlement, Jessica had thrown herself into her work with renewed determination. She had expanded her contributions beyond Jeffrey's household, helping other families with tasks that required additional hands. She had assisted Cynthia in the infirmary, learning basic medical skills that proved valuable when injuries occurred. She had even begun teaching some of the younger women more efficient methods of food preservation and household management. The strategy had been as successful in demonstrating her value to the broader community, but it had also increased her visibility and, by extension, her vulnerability to Ronald's machinations. Jessica had begun to notice how certain conversations stopped when she entered a room, how some people seemed to be evaluating her actions with unusual scrutiny. The crisis had come suddenly, as such things often did in communities balanced on the edge of survival. A hunting party led by Jason Morales had failed to return from what should have been a routine expedition to check distant trap lines. When a search party found their camp abandoned and signs of a struggle, the settlement had erupted into barely controlled panic. Jason Morales was Ronald Kelly's nephew and closest ally, a man whose loyalty and competence were essential to Ronald's power base. His disappearance, along with two other experienced hunters, represented both a personal loss and a political disaster for Ronald. The settlement could ill afford to lose such valuable members, and the circumstances of their disappearance suggested threats that went beyond the usual dangers of winter hunting. Jeffrey had volunteered to lead the expanded search effort, bringing together the settlement's most skilled trackers and woodsmen. Jessica had watched him prepare for the expedition with growing anxiety, understanding that this mission would be far more dangerous than his usual solo excursions. The weather was worsening, and the signs at the abandoned camp suggested that whatever had happened to Jason's party might still pose a threat to rescuers. "I should go with you," Jessica had said as Jeffrey checked his equipment one final time. He had looked at her with something that might have been surprise. "This isn't work for someone without experience in winter tracking." "I have experience now," Jessica had replied firmly. "Months of it. I know the trap lines, I can read weather signs, and I can handle myself in difficult conditions. You might need someone you can trust absolutely." Jeffrey had considered her words carefully, and Jessica had seen the moment when his evaluation of her capabilities shifted. She was no longer the desperate refugee who had arrived at his door, always begging for work. She had become someone whose skills and judgment he valued, someone who might genuinely be useful in a dangerous situation. "Ronald won't approve," Jeffrey had warned. "He'll see it as another example of my judgment being compromised by personal concerns." "Let him," Jessica had replied with a confidence that surprised even her. "We both know this isn't about personal concerns. It's about finding Jason and the others before it's too late." In the end, Jeffrey had agreed to include her in the search party, though he had insisted that she stay close to him and follow his lead without question. Jessica had accepted the conditions gladly, understanding that this expedition would test not only her survival skills, but also her place in the settlement's social hierarchy. The search party had set out before dawn, following the trail left by Jason's group into the wilderness beyond the settlement's usual hunting grounds. The going had been difficult from the start, with deep snow and bitter wind making every step a struggle. But Jeffrey had pressed forward with the relentless determination of someone who understood that time was their enemy as much as the weather. Jessica had found herself drawing on reserves of strength and endurance that she hadn't known she possessed. The months of hard work and harsh living had transformed her body as much as her mind, giving her the physical capabilities needed to keep pace with experienced woodsmen. She had felt a fierce pride in her ability to contribute meaningfully to the effort, to be seen as a valuable member of the team rather than a burden to be protected. As they had followed the trail deeper into the wilderness, the signs of struggle had become more apparent. Broken branches, scattered equipment, and patches of disturbed snow told a story of sudden violence and desperate flight. But there had been no bodies, no clear indication of what had befallen Jason's party or whether they might still be alive. It was Jessica who had first spotted the smoke rising from a distant valley, a thin column barely visible against the gray sky. Jeffrey had studied it through the crude telescope he carried, his expression growing increasingly grim as he evaluated what they were seeing. "That's not a campfire, Nambe Sawire," he had said quietly. "Too much smoke, wrong color. Something's burning that shouldn't be." The discovery had changed the nature of their mission from search and rescue to something far more dangerous. Whatever had happened to Jason's party was still ongoing, and the search team was walking into a situation that could easily claim more lives. But Jeffrey had pressed forward without hesitation, driven by the same sense of duty that had led him to defend Jessica in the Great Hall. The burning structure had turned out to be a small hunting lodge, one of several remote shelters maintained by the settlement for use during extended expeditions. The building had been deliberately destroyed, its contents scattered and burned in what appeared to be an act of calculated vandalism rather than random violence. Among the debris, they had found signs that Jason's party had taken shelter there before whatever had befallen them occurred. Jeffrey had examined the scene with the methodical attention of someone trained to read the stories told by physical evidence. The tracks around the lodge suggested that Jason's group had been surprised by a larger force, possibly raiders from another settlement who had been watching their movements and waiting for an opportunity to strike. They were taken alive, Jeffrey had concluded after studying the evidence. The attackers wanted prisoners, not just their equipment. Jessica had felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Captives taken by hostile raiders face fates that were often worse than death, especially if their captors viewed them as sources of information about the settlement's defenses and resources. The implications for Jason and his companions were horrifying, but the threat to their home community was equally serious. The trail had led away from the burned lodge toward the north into territory that none of the search party knew well. Jeffrey had faced a difficult decision: pursue the raiders into unknown and potentially hostile territory, or return to the settlement with the news of what they had discovered. The weather was worsening, their supplies were limited, and they had no idea how many enemies they might be facing. But as Jeffrey had weighed the options, Jessica had found herself thinking about the broader implications of their choice. If they returned empty-handed, Ronald would undoubtedly blame Jeffrey for the failure, using Jason's loss as the evidence that Jeffrey's judgment was indeed compromised. More importantly, abandoning Jason and his companions would send a message to potential enemies that the settlement's people could be attacked with impunity. "We have to go after them," Jessica had said, voicing what she suspected Jeffrey was already thinking. "It's dangerous," Jeffrey had replied. "We don't know the terrain. We don't know how many enemies we're facing, and we don't know if Jason's party is even still alive. But we know what happens if we don't try," Jessica had countered. "Ronald will use this against you, and the settlement will look weak to anyone who might be watching. Sometimes the dangerous choice is the only real choice." Jeffrey had looked at her with something that might have been admiration. "You're learning to think like a survivor." "I'm learning to think like someone who belongs here," Jessica had replied, and she had realized as she spoke the words that they were true. Somewhere during the long months of struggle and adaptation, she had stopped seeing herself as a refugee seeking shelter and had begun to identify fully with the settlement and its people. The pursuit had led them through increasingly treacherous terrain, following a trail that wound through dense forests and across frozen streams. The raiders had been confident enough to make little effort to conceal their passage, suggesting either arrogance or superior numbers. Jeffrey had pressed the pace as much as the conditions allowed, understanding that their chances of success diminished with every hour that passed. It was late in the afternoon when they had finally caught sight of their quarry. The raiders had made camp in a sheltered valley, apparently confident that they were not being pursued. From their concealed position on the ridge above, Jessica had counted at least a dozen men gathered around several fires, with what appeared to be prisoners bound near one of the larger shelters. Jeffrey had studied the enemy camp with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating a tactical problem. The raiders outnumbered the search party by more than 2-1, and they held the advantage of a prepared position. A direct assault would be suicidal, but stealth offered possibilities for someone willing to take enormous risks. "I'm going down there," Jeffrey had announced quietly. "The rest of you wait here and be ready to move quickly when I signal." Jessica had felt her heart stop. "That's suicide. There are too many of them." "Not if I'm careful," Jeffrey had replied. "I can get close enough to free the prisoners and create enough confusion for them to escape. You and the others can provide covering fire if things go wrong." But Jessica had seen the flaw in his plan immediately. Even if Jeffrey succeeded in freeing Jason and his companions, they would all be trapped in the valley with a superior force between them and safety. The raiders would hunt them down long before they could reach the settlement, and more good people would die in the wilderness. "There's another way," Jessica had said, the plan forming in her mind even as she spoke. "Let me go down there first. Alone." The idea had been met with immediate and vehement opposition from every member of the search party, But Jessica had pressed her case with the kind of logical determination that Jeffrey himself might have used. A woman approaching the raider camp would be seen as less threatening than an armed man, giving her a better chance of getting close to the prisoners without raising immediate alarm. More importantly, her presence would draw attention away from Jeffrey's position, allowing him to position himself more advantageously. "They'll capture you or worse," Jeffrey had protested, his usual calm cracking for the first time since she had known him. "Maybe," Jessica had admitted, "but if they do, you'll know exactly where everyone is and can plan accordingly. And if I can create enough distraction, you might be able to free all the prisoners at once instead of trying to do it piecemeal." The debate had continued for precious minutes while the light faded and their window of opportunity narrowed. But eventually, Jeffrey had been forced to acknowledge the tactical soundness of Jessica's proposal, even as everything in his nature rebelled against allowing her to take such a risk. "If you do this," he had said finally, "you follow my instructions exactly. No improvisation, no heroics. You get close, you create a distraction, and you get out of the way so we can do our job." Jessica had agreed to his conditions, though she had understood that once she entered the enemy camp, she would be largely on her own. Plans rarely survived contact with reality, and she would have to rely on her own judgment and resourcefulness to survive whatever came next. The descent into the valley had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Jessica had moved as quietly as possible through the gathering darkness, using the natural terrain to conceal her approach. Her heart had hammered against her ribs, but her mind had remained clear and focused on the task ahead. The raiders had been exactly what she had expected. Hard men made cruel by harsh circumstances and the absence of civilizing influences. They had treated their prisoners with casual brutality, and Jessica had seen evidence of the kind of violence that made survival in the wilderness a constant struggle against both nature and human nature. But she had also seen an opportunity in their arrogance and complacency. The raiders had posted minimal guards and were focused more on celebrating their success than on maintaining security. They had been drinking heavily, and several were already showing the effects of alcohol on their judgment and reflexes. Jessica had worked her way to within 50 yards of the camp before deliberately revealing herself, stumbling into the firelight as if exhausted and lost. The reaction had been immediate and predictable. Shouts of surprise, weapons drawn, and rough hands seizing her before she could flee or resist. "Well, well," the raider leader had said, looking her over with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating potential merchandise. "What have we here? Another lost lamb wandering in the wilderness?" Jessica had forced herself to appear terrified and helpless, playing into their expectations, while secretly cataloging everything she observed about the camp's layout and defenses. She had located Jason and his companions, bound but apparently unharmed, and had noted the positions of weapons and supplies that might be useful in the coming fight. "Please," she had begged, allowing her voice to shake with what appeared to be fear. "I'm lost. I've been wandering for days. I just need shelter until morning." The raiders had laughed at her apparent helplessness, but their leader had studied her with eyes that missed little. "Lost, are you? Funny how lost people keep finding their way to our camp. Makes a man wonder if maybe they're not as lost as they claim." Jessica had felt a chill of recognition that her deception might not be as successful as she had hoped. But before she could respond, the sound of Jeffrey's war cry had echoed across the valley, and the night had erupted into violence and chaos. The battle had been brief but vicious, with Jeffrey and the search party attacking from multiple directions while the raiders struggled to organize a defense. Jessica had used the confusion to free Jason and his companions, cutting their bonds with a knife she had concealed in her boot, while the attention of their guards was focused on the larger fight. But the raiders had been experienced fighters, and they had recovered from their initial surprise more quickly than Jessica had hoped. The leader had rallied his men and begun to organize a counterattack that threatened to overwhelm the smaller rescue party through sheer numbers and superior position. It was then that Jessica had made the decision that would define not only the outcome of the battle, but her own understanding of who she had become. Instead of fleeing with the freed prisoners as planned, she had seized a fallen raider's axe and thrown herself into the fight alongside Jeffrey and the others. The weapon had felt natural in her hands, as if all the months of hard work and harsh living had been preparing her for this moment. She had fought with the desperate fury of someone defending not just her own life, but the lives of people she had come to love, and the raiders had found themselves facing an enemy more determined and capable than they had expected. The tide of battle had turned when Jeffrey and Jessica had fought their way to the raider leader, working together with the kind of seamless coordination that spoke of deep mutual trust and understanding. The man had been skilled and dangerous, but he had not been prepared to face two opponents who fought as if they shared a single mind. When it was over, the surviving raiders had fled into the darkness, leaving behind their supplies and equipment in their haste to escape. Jason and his companions had been weak but unharmed, and the search party had emerged victorious despite being outnumbered and fighting on unfavorable ground. But for Jessica, the real victory had been the look in Jeffrey's eyes as they had stood together in the aftermath of the battle. She had seen recognition there, acknowledgement that she had become something more than the desperate refugee he had taken in months earlier. She was now his partner in the truest sense, someone who could be trusted with his life and the lives of others. The journey back to the settlement had been triumphant, with Jason and his companions telling and retelling the story of their rescue to anyone who would listen. But Jessica had found herself thinking less about the battle itself than about what it represented in terms of her own transformation and her relationship with Jeffrey. When they had finally reached the settlement and been welcomed as heroes, Jessica had noticed how the other residents looked at her. The whispers and speculation that had followed her for months had been replaced by something that looked very much like respect. She had proven herself in the most fundamental way possible, demonstrating that she was not just a burden to be tolerated, but a valuable member of the community. Ronald Kelly had been forced to publicly acknowledge their success, though Jessica had seen the calculation in his eyes that suggested he was already planning his next move. But for the moment, she felt secure in a way that had nothing to do with Jeffrey's protection or the community's tolerance. She had earned her place through her own actions and abilities. That night, as she and Jeffrey sat by their fire and reflected on all that had happened, Jessica had finally found the words to express what she had been feeling for months. "I'm not the same person who came here begging for work," she had said. Jeffrey had smiled, one of the few times she had seen such an expression on his weathered face. "No, you're not. You're someone who belongs here, someone who's earned the right to call this place home." As the fire crackled and the winter wind howled outside their warm dwelling, Jessica had understood that she had found something she had thought lost forever. A place where she was valued not for what she had been, but for what she had become. The desperate woman who had once been willing to sleep in a barn had been transformed into someone who could stand as an equal beside the strongest and most respected members of the community. The future remained uncertain, with challenges and dangers that would test her resolve and abilities. But Jessica faced that future with confidence, knowing that she had the strength to meet whatever came next, and the partnership of a man who had seen her potential when she could not see it herself. In the end, she had found more than just work and shelter. She had found herself.